Hi there, welcome to my channel. My name is David, and today we're going to be talking about Cumbia, which is a genre of music from Latin America. Now in Latin America, there are very few constants. The Spanish-speaking countries in Central and South America are diverse and different in more ways than I would ever have time to cover in a single video. That being said, there's a rhythmic pulse that can be heard almost everywhere in Latin America, from the tip of South America to the barrios of Mexico City to Costa Rica, where I live. And of course, that rhythm is cumbia. And if you've never heard of it, you're definitely missing out. If you've heard Shakira, you've probably actually already heard this rhythm before, or maybe Bad Bunny, you might have heard a version of it in some of his stuff. But it's so much more than that. It's kind of an endless rabbit hole of music. I really believe that no matter what you like, there is something in this genre for you. I guarantee it. Now, cumbia is a genre with a really distinct rhythm. And in this video, I'd like to show how this beat, originally from the Caribbean coast of Colombia, took over airwaves across Latin America, as well as how to listen to it, what you're listening for, and how to enjoy it in all its various styles and forms. And that's a pretty tall task, given how many subgenres there are of cumbia. Definitely not going to be able to cover every subgenre of this huge world of music, but I think I can give a really good bird's eye perspective. Plus, if you stick around to the end, I'll give you some great recommendations to kick off your cumbia listening journey. So grab a coffee, get a snack, and let's dive into the world of cumbia. But just quickly before we get started with any context, let me show you how the cumbia rhythm sounds. In every subgenre of cumbia, this sound is present, and it forms the backbone of every cumbia song you're likely to hear. It's this beat right here. Now, of course, there are variations and different beats that play with this rhythm, but this is it in its most simplified and basic form. That's so simple, right? How can an entire genre, especially one as diverse as cumbia, rest on such a simple rhythm? And something I've heard from people who have heard of cumbia but don't really like it or get it is that it all kind of sounds the same. And who would want to listen to a genre where everything sounds so similar? Now, of course, I don't agree with this. The more trained your ear is for a particular genre, the more distinct the nuances are going to seem. I'm sure you've heard people say this about all sorts of genres, like all country sounds the same, all rap, all punk, all jazz. And I think it's less of a reflection on the genre and more of a reflection on how tuned in an individual's ear is to the sounds of a certain genre, if that makes any sense. Now, cumbia definitely has a formula, just like blues has a formula, but it's so diverse that I think it even stretches the definition of genre in the first place. Now, if you're from Latin America, or if you have a Latino family background, then this seems really silly, right? Who hasn't heard of cumbia? Well, I grew up in a suburb of Toronto, Canada, and I had next to no exposure to Latin music genres. I did hear some salsa or older genres like mariachi maybe, but it was always filtered through kind of a semi-racist, stereotypical lens, and usually to sell like exotic food products. 15-year-old David already loved music, but would never have heard of cumbia. And I think there's a lot of people out there who also may have had limited exposure to these amazing genres. And I really don't want to come off as smugly gringo-splaining a working class Latin genre, but rather I'd like to communicate my respect for the genre and show people who may not have heard this music before how cool it is. Now, I'm not a musicologist. I'm just a guy who likes music, but I'll do my best. And in order to do that, we need to figure out where cumbia came from and why its various styles sound the way they do today, which is honestly a pretty difficult task. Cumbia has a very murky and hotly debated origin. It's not even a single narrative. It's kind of like a cloud of competing origin stories. But first, I'll stick to what we know is true. The cumbia beat is rooted in the dance rhythms of enslaved Africans who were forcibly transported to the Caribbean coast of Colombia. This early history is inseparable from the history of cumbia as a dance, as well as the despicable practice of chattel slavery. In its earliest forms, cumbia seems to have been a form of courtship dance performed by these enslaved people. Many of these individuals escaped and formed small towns further inland, where these rhythms further developed and integrated with indigenous Amerindian cultures. Indigenous instruments like the gaita flute joined the drums and started to form the early folk ensemble version of cumbia that's still preserved today with groups like Los Gaiteros de San Jacinto. Check them out, they're fantastic. At that point, cumbia began to blend with big band orchestras as its sound became more popular in the wealthier and whiter cities of Colombia's interior. Many reflect on the songs of this period as national treasures, while others see them as a whitewashing or dilution of the original style. I think both camps have a point, but cumbia wouldn't stop there. Cumbia fever had only just begun, and in the decades that followed, cumbia would mean a lot of different things to a lot of different peoples. Now, before we talk about cumbia's international phase, there's something that we have to address, and that is class. Because throughout cumbia's history, it's been looked down upon for being poor, working class, even unsophisticated. And unfortunately, some people still have this attitude about the genre today. Cumbia is generally not very fancy. It thrives in nightclubs or parking lots with makeshift sound systems. Folk festivals. That's not to say that there aren't big stadium shows, there definitely are, just much fewer black tie events. Now in its early days, cumbia remained a mostly Colombian phenomenon, but its first franchise expansion was almost certainly into Mexico. Again, like a lot of cumbia's history, this particular handoff is unfortunately shrouded in mystery with plenty of competing narratives. One thing we know for sure is that a Colombian named Luis Carlos Mayor Castandet came to Mexico in the 1950s and released La Cumbia Sinegüera, potentially the first cumbia produced outside of Colombia. So what contributed to cumbia's continued success in Mexico? Well, it's complicated. There are tales of a Colombian diaspora yearning for home, narcos with planes full of drugs sharing cumbia tapes on the side, and an increased interest in the Mexican music scene for anything coastal or tropical. One thing's for sure. By the time the 1970s came around, cumbia was a part of the Mexican musical landscape in a big way all across the country. Mexico and other Central American countries started producing their own cumbia artists for the first time, while still importing sounds, musicians, and records from ground zero in Colombia. And as the decades rolled on and cumbia's popularity began to grow, Mexico developed a couple of its own absolutely unique cumbia genres, like cumbia norteña from the north of Mexico, or cumbia sonidera, whose homebrewed audio equipment sound has made it a permanent part of Mexico City's music scene. So the next stage in cumbia's development is unexpected, but really cool. In the 1960s, cumbia began taking off in Peru, but the sound had completely changed. Things took a turn for the psychedelic. This genre of Peruvian cumbia is called chicha, and it's named after a corn-based booze that was enjoyed by the Inca. It was a completely unique take on the genre, and it came out of the oil boom cities of the Peruvian Amazon. It combined pentatonic Andean scales and psychedelic trance-like repetition. Also, surf rock influences like buzzing guitars and wah-wah pedals would be added to the mix, creating the classic chicha combo we know today. Now, the first time I heard this music, I absolutely fell in love. And if you've never heard of it or ever listened to it, I think you're in for a real treat. It's groovy, it's psychedelic, it's far out, but it still relies on that distinct cumbia rhythm. Before we move on, let's go back to Mexico for a quick second, because there's another cumbia scene that I'd really like to shout out. And that's the one that started in Monterrey in the 1990s, called Cumbia Rebajada. So the disputed origin story of Cumbia Rebajada is that this DJ in the Independencia neighborhood of Monterrey found his record player, he's playing a gig, and he found that his record player was slowing down from overuse. And this groovy, slowed down cumbia serendipitously kicked off one of the coolest music scenes in all of Mexico. Cumbia was already really big in Monterrey, thanks to artists like Celso Piña, but the sound of this genre was something very different. Sometimes Rebajada songs are classic Colombian cumbias that have been chopped up and slowed down. And other times they're originals with added effects. But it's really about a vibe with this genre. There's a feeling to it. It's chopped up and messy, and I love it. So here's the part of the video where I talk about why I like cumbia personally, and why I think it deserves to be in your listening rotation as well. So for me, there are three major things that make cumbia so special. My first point is cumbia's surprising universality. I've said this before, but it's worth underlining that besides the Catholic Church, the Spanish language, and soccer, cumbia may be the number one thing that Latin American countries, at least Spanish-speaking Latin American countries, have in common culturally. My second point is a little vague. It's that cumbia is usually a genre of celebration, togetherness. It's fun stuff. Cumbia is a genre rooted in dance, right? So it makes you want to move. Obviously, there's some genres, some styles that are mixed with jazz. They're not meant for the dance floor, but most styles are. And the distinctive rhythm of cumbia kind of makes you move whether you want to or not. And I'm not a very good dancer. Like, I'm a starchy white guy that has the grace of like a newborn giraffe. The only places I'll dance is at like a wedding if I've had too much to drink. But if you have a cumbia on and I'm alone, some dancing's gonna take place. The third thing I really like about cumbia is its inherent lack of pretentiousness. It's a working class genre. A lot of musicians and music nerds kind of look down on it for being unsophisticated, and it's really unfair. Just like hip hop or blues or bluegrass, it comes from poor or working class people. And I don't think that's something that should make a genre any better or worse. It's just part of its story. In the case of cumbia, it's an essential part of its character. Cumbia is not fancy, and it doesn't want to be. That's something that you'll notice about the genre wherever you find it. It's unpretentious, it's art, and it's a lot of fun. It's just so cool that no matter where you go in this incredibly diverse genre, you find this same theme. It's never lost its position as the people's music. And finally, here we are with some recommendations. Now, this is by no means a definitive list. I'm definitely going to miss a bunch of stuff. So it's just a collection of music that I like. And if you're new to the genre, I hope you like it as well. Now I'm going to split this up into Colombian, Mexican, and Peruvian cumbia. Not because other types don't matter, but because I have to put walls around this, or I could just talk about this all day. And a special apology to Panama and Argentina. They both have an amazing cumbia tradition. I'm just not going to get to it here. And also, I'll mention some albums, but since so many cumbia classics came out as singles, I'll mention a lot of just artists and song names. So with cumbia, do not be afraid of the compilation album, because that's actually where you'll find a lot of the best stuff. Alright, let's start where this all began. And of course, that means Colombia. And with Colombian cumbia, I think there's only one place where it's really fair to begin. And that's with the 2006 album by Los Gaiteros de San Jacinto, Un Fuego de Sangre Pura. And I know 2006 seems a little late, but I've chosen this album because Los Gaiteros are playing in the original folkloric style of a very early cumbia tradition. Now, this might not be the most accessible starting point for some, but I'm sure you can get there. This is the taste you'll be glad that you acquired. Throw on some good headphones if you have them, keep an open mind, and allow yourself to experience something new. I think it's hard not to fall in love with the drums, flutes, and vocals that drive this incredible album. These guys are keeping a really important tradition alive, and this is where all the recommendations coming up are really springing from. So some respect for the original sound. For some other classics, not of the original folk tradition, I'll give you a rapid-fire 3-song mixtape. First, we have La Danza Negra by the famous Lucho Bermudez, featuring Matilde Diaz. This is that ballroom orchestra cumbia I was talking about earlier. Definitely one of those wait for the drop songs too, with the tune really kicking off around 20 seconds in. This is a charming classic from an era of big bands and flashy arrangements. So different from the earlier folk tradition, and perhaps even more different from the examples still to come. Number 2 is Pollera Colora by Pedro Salcedo and Wilson Choporena. This song is great. It's got such a fantastic celebratory feel. It's got a great focus too on an instrument called La Flauta de Mio, which produces a really unique clarinet-like sound, and it's a staple in a lot of different cumbia traditions. And the third classic Colombian song is Diario de un Borracho, or The Diary of a Drunk, by Aniceto Molina. It's a decidedly dark turn for cumbia, but there's some really creative vocal melody choices in this song. I think it's hard to hate and easy to get lost in. And if the retro Colombian music really isn't your vibe, here are some more contemporary Colombian cumbia songs to check out. Here they are in quick succession. First, Tesoro de Amor by El Friki and Juanes and Alfredo Gutierrez. Second, a song called Panchita by Los Lloris. And a special mention for number 3, a really cool song called Cumbia del Monte Fuji, which is a collaboration between a Japanese band called the Mino Crusaders and a Colombian new cumbia outfit called Frente Cumbiero. So here we are at Mexican Cumbia. And for Mexico, I'll make my own short greatest hits album, and then add some notes about specific subgenres. Alright, first up is El Listón de tu Pelo by Los Angeles Azules. This group is massive. They have so many great songs spanning 4 decades. They're basically a hit machine. Number 2 is a hilarious guilty pleasure called El Colesterol by Fito Olivares y su grupo. And this one is definitely worth looking up the translated lyrics to. My recommendation for number 3 is a famous song called Llorar by Los Socios de Ritmo. It's a classic, slightly campy hit from the 80s, but it's definitely worth listening to. This group had already been killing it for 2 decades when this banger came out, and if you like it, there's plenty more where that came from. And lastly, number 4, Cumbia sobre el río by Celsa Piña. If you like this one, please dig into this guy's catalog. He's a seriously talented musician, and unfortunately was lost way too soon. And now as a bonus, just some really quick notes on Mexican subgenres of cumbia. Now I've already mentioned Cumbia Rebajada, but you won't find a lot of the best stuff on Spotify. I'd recommend searching on YouTube, where you'll find custom playlists and mixtape videos. There is a band called Supergrupo Colombia. They're not from Colombia, by the way, they're from Monterrey, but it's a really good place to start. Just make sure you have plenty of beer and preferably a crackling PA speaker ready. I'd also just like to mention that I didn't forget about Norteña Cumbia. I'm just going to leave this one in the dark as I'm planning a future video on Norteña music in general, so just stay curious about that one. And lastly, I'd just like to shout out the sonidero scene in Mexico City. There's a band I want you guys to check out called Grupo Cual. In fact, a specific song to get you started is Las Mujeres No Se Acaban. And if that doesn't get you moving, you're probably dead. And our last stop for recommendations is of course Peru, where I'm going to be focusing on chicha. For this genre, I'm going to recommend an album to get started, and then I'm going to list off some groups that are really great entry points. The album I'm referring to is a compilation record called The Roots of Chicha, which was released on an American label called Barbez. It has most of the early chicha classics that'll get you hooked. I think some of these songs may no longer be available on Spotify, so look for it in other places. You guys are resourceful. Now before we move on to those artists, I'd just like to make a quick note. Chicha music has a bit of a reputation for being to record collectors what IPAs might be to beer hipsters. Essentially, some record heads think others like it just because it's trendy. But I say, who cares? While others are busy judging, I'll be listening to chicha with a tall, frosty pint of the most bitter IPA you can possibly imagine. Now that's what I call a good night. Okay, I'll get off my soapbox. As far as bands go, definitely check out Los Mirlos, Los Destellos, Guaneco y su combo, Los Hijos del Sol, and a special shout out to a band called Chicha Libre, an international outfit formed in Brooklyn in 2006. They are by no means first wave, super authentic chicha, but they do a pretty great job reviving the sound of Peruvian style cumbia for new audiences, I think. Definitely worth checking out. Now, I could talk about cumbia all day, but I think I'm gonna have to wrap this one up here, so thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already. And let me know if there's a genre of Latin American music that you'd like to see a future video on. So that's all for now. Hasta la próxima, chicos.